This is the third lecture, the start of the third lecture that I'm recording here in October for the fall of 2021 for Human Anat and Phys. We just looked, or you might have just listened to, two of the recorded lectures that were over the end of our information on the muscular system. Today, the third lecture, begins our look at the nervous system. And this is what we'll be looking at from here on out before lecture exam 3. We're going to be at this for a while, about 3 weeks of this. So hang in there. And the fact that these are recorded and that you have the PowerPoints already and that you have an excellent textbook with excellent presentations really does make this stuff really straightforward and well organized for you to study. But you have to sit down. You have to interact with the information. Remember that every term that you might have to define, that you want to have some way to quiz yourself over the definitions of those terms. Think of the other ways and other things that you need to study, the comparison contrast, functional significance. There's a lot of comparison contrast. We're going to be talking about the central nervous system today and also the peripheral nervous system today. There are an awful lot of comparison contrast opportunities here within today's lecture and really the rest of our look at the nervous system. So here we go. First of all, before we get to the nervous system, we should spend a little time understanding another system as well, which controls really in a coordinated way most of the systems of the body. So when you think about the heart, think about the lungs, think about your digestive tract, your reproductive tract, your urinary tract, your skin even, and your brain. These things are all interconnected by two different kinds of systems that are actually related to each other in some ways, anatomically and functionally. And those are the endocrine system, which, remember, when we looked at different types of tissues, we said that glands, which were types of epithelia, belong to two categories. And those categories are exocrine glands and endocrine glands. And that's a comparison contrast question right there. The defining difference between an exocrine gland, an exocrine gland, and an endocrine gland, do you remember what that was? How is it that the glandular products are released? Exocrine glands have ducts. They release their products by a duct, like the salivary glands on your cheeks, using ducts to release saliva inside your mouth at very specific locations. Endocrine glands do not have ducts. No ducts at all. So how do endocrine glands release their products? And the answer is into the bloodstream. They do it directly into the bloodstream. All right, so that's a rather indirect way to send a signal. Okay, it's some kind of very diffuse signal. It's kind of like honking your horn on your car, or gosh, any kind of alarm bell or anything going off. It's a broadcasted big signal. It's not really targeted. Targeted would be you making a phone call or texting, specifically, of course, to someone else. That would be very targeted. That targeted kind of signaling is characteristic of the nervous system. The endocrine signals are much more like the broadcast, like blasting your horn. Or, if you understand that chemicals can be signals, it's kind of like perfumes or cologne or anything that's, I hope, pleasant, smells pleasant, perhaps freshly baked brownies. If you're somewhere near a meal right now, maybe I'm going to make you hungry. But those are signals too that are broadcast generally, right? So the signals coming off of perhaps you or someone else, and you're wearing some kind of perfume, it's kind of a signal. It indicates, I don't know, whatever it is you're expressing. All right. So there you go. Here's a gigantic chart that makes all sorts of comparisons. So folks, I could have a comparison and contrast question that says endocrine system versus nervous system. Compare them on the basis of whether or not they're disconnected or interconnected. These are all sort of wired, you can think about it as sort of wired together. But these, remember, endocrine systems only release their product into the bloodstream. Look at the speed of response. So the comparison contrast question could be endocrine versus nervous system, speed of response. Slow versus fast. How about the duration of response? Long versus short. So let's go back up to the top, which I skipped over rather quickly because things are the same. Both systems are hugely important in maintaining homeostasis. There are parts of your brain where we are thinking. They're the ones that you're largely using right now to interpret sound, to follow what I'm saying, to listen for my articulation, to see if you can tell what it is. What's the Lisco saying? Okay. And then there's other parts of your brain that are actually about regulating heartbeat, regulating blood pressure, balance, so many of the important things to stay alive. And that's homeostasis. Okay? Endocrine system does the same. Both systems, as I mentioned at the beginning, both systems work with other systems and both have feedback. So what's a feedback mechanism? Well, you have probably a thermostat maybe in your home or an apartment, wherever you might live. And that thermostat measures the temperature of your home. In the wintertime here, as temperatures are getting colder, as the temperatures get colder inside your home, the thermostat, which is like the endocrine system and the nervous system, detects, it has that feedback mechanism, it detects the temperature, turns on the system, and then as the product goes up, which is heat, your furnace heats up the place, eventually the furnace is going to heat up your home to the point that the thermostat detects that and turns off the heat. So, through the wintertime, it's usually the case, unless it's really cold outside, your furnace heat turns off and on. It's not always generating a lot of heat. And so that's a feedback mechanism. Maybe you can think about it in your home, a room that you visit maybe many times or several times during the day also has a feedback system, and it involves water. So can you think of what that feedback system might be in your home involving water? And maybe you thought of your toilet. So you flush a toilet, and what that does is it immediately releases a great deal of water. And then, after things have been flushed, you hear water running. And that's right, it's refilling, probably, the tank that's behind the seat on the toilet. And as that tank refills, you really, really hope that the water shuts off when the tank is full. Maybe you've had to repair these things, maybe you've had to go in there and mess with them to get the water to turn off and on. That certainly is something I had to do, something I still have to do, because I often lived in crummy places, because most of my life, I have not had much money. Lucky thing is, eventually, if you save up, you get to a point where you have a little bit more at least. All right, so connected only by blood vessels. And here, the brain is connected to the spinal cord. Spinal cord, in turn, is connected to the nerves that go out into the body. So we're going to talk all about this system. So, you have some kind of reaction. Think about a big bang or an explosion that might happen. And you hear it. My goodness, you hear it right away. That's the point. Fractions of a second. If it is close by, fractions of a second. And you might jump. You might react by jumping. And then about 5 to 10 seconds later, your endocrine system might have pumped some hormones into your bloodstream, and you suddenly start feeling that effect. And your heart rate is up. You can feel yourself getting very, very excited. It's a slower response. However, the hormones last so much longer in your bloodstream than this short reaction of jumping, for example, when you heard a blast. Now, the nervous system, when we go forward, and this will be a big part of what I'm talking about today. The nervous system functionally can be divided up into 3 steps. Okay? These are logical. Please do not make this difficult. It's just, we add some words, some terms. You might not have phrased it that way, but I promise you, this is perfectly logical. Sensory input is just, we got information. Our senses are gathering it. Make sure you understand this could be sight or sound or smell or taste or touch or balance. It could be that you're thrown off balance. Okay? So we have sensory input that's monitoring what the heck is going around inside us, going around outside us. Okay, so sensing inside us, outside us, that's what we're detecting. Okay. And of course, mostly what we detect are changes, something that's happening differently. The second step is that sensory information is brought pretty much to your brain, usually your brain. It might just be your spinal cord. We'll look at some exceptions there. But let's use this as an example for your brain for integration. Sensory information is brought in. For example, you might smell something. You might hear something. And when you put together the smell of smoke and hearing crackling, it might suggest to you, as you integrate those 2 senses, that's consistent with a fire. Maybe you're out camping and you're hearing a fire. Maybe there's a fire you built, so maybe that's not a surprise. Okay. Integration also involves memory. So as you're gathering information, you remember, and that's a big part of recognition. And I always think about this when I'm driving down the road, usually long trips, and there's something on the road, so it's probably not a big interstate, but there's something on the road in front of us, and what the heck is that? Now, I'm lucky enough that I've gotten to travel in all 50 states and all Canadian provinces and Mexico, so I've been all over the place. And the places that I've gone, it could be an alligator, it could be a roadrunner, it could be an elk, it could be a grizzly bear. I've driven past a grizzly bear before out by a highway. So when I see things, and by the way, the grizzly bear was one such example, I couldn't believe my eyes. So I was driving, actually someone else was driving at the time. We were in Alaska, and I'm looking up ahead, and I see something looks big and massive. And I take in the information about how the animal, or if it's an animal, is moving, right? It could be a shadow or something. And as we get closer and closer and closer, I collect more information. And son of a gun, looks like a big bear. And it turned out the person with me was a wildlife biologist at the University of Alaska in Anchorage, and he couldn't believe it either, but he confirmed it. Okay. Well, that's all integration. Sensory information coming in. It changes as it comes in, right? You get closer when you're driving, so you're getting more information. And then you're trying to use that information and your memory to say, wow, based on everything I know, what does that look like, right? Okay. So another part, as it says right here, about integration is making sense out of what you're learning and then determining a response. So an action might be necessary, but you should know that a decision on action can be don't do anything. And perhaps there's been times in your life, maybe when you're getting a vaccination, that you know a stimulus is coming, somebody's going to poke you with a needle. And so you've decided you're not going to move. You're not going to jump or leap because otherwise they could screw this thing up. So it's possible that your decision on action is actually a decision not to act. Okay. By the way, got my third shot booster for, they're doing it for teachers now. And it's been 8 months, so it was a good idea to get the COVID booster. And when I got the injection last Friday, I could not even feel a thing. I literally, she injected me and I went, "Is that it?" She said, "Yeah, I did." And she said she gets that from a lot of people. They don't even feel it. So anyway, well, when we said action, that's really this third step. It's, well, what are you going to do about it, right? So you're going to swat the fly that's been bugging you. You hear what I say, you think about what it is that you should do, and you might decide to write something down. That's it, guys. Sensory input, you listen to me. Integration, you're making sense out of it and deciding what you should write. And then motor output is tell your arm to move in certain ways, of course, including your hand, and to type or write something. Okay, guys, I cannot emphasize enough, it can be this easy. You got to keep coming back to this frame of reference over and over and over, and you'll really make sense out of a rather complicated system. Now, when I just had one little point here, it might not always be that motor output is activating a muscle. You might remember when we talked one time about you got maybe a lemon wedge that came with your soda or who knows, your beer or whatever. And you've taken that lemon wedge and you're about to put it in your mouth and bite into it. And even now, as I'm describing this, my mouth is getting more moist. And some of you may have the experience that you put that lemon wedge right in front of your face and you're about to bite into it. And the motor output from your brain, so you've sensed that you've got a lemon wedge in front of you. You've moved that lemon wedge right in front of your lips. You've thought about, wait a minute, this is going to be really sour. Do I really want to do this? That's your integration. Then you decide, yeah, go ahead. And then the decision as you are moving that muscular-wise, moving that lemon wedge into your mouth, your glands have been signaled to release a lot of saliva. Okay? So, folks, what you're looking at is a breakdown of what you're doing all the time. In fact, we do this when we're asleep just as well. We react to sensory information in our environment. And we actually know that the environment, characteristics of the environment where you sleep, may be integrated into your dreams. A little trivia, I didn't plan to talk about this right now, but motor output. So when you dream and you're doing things in your dream, do you act them out? Right? I mean, do we see people walking and moving their hands and swatting and doing whatever we're doing in the dream? And the answer is normally no. And the reason is because we have part of our brain that shuts that down. The motor output gets suppressed when we're dreaming. Yeah. Anyway, more about that maybe a little bit later or certainly in a psych class. So here again is the first figure that just plain old breaks us down. Sensory input, integration, motor output. Well, what we're soon going to learn is this is the central nervous system, and these two branches are the peripheral nervous system. Why? This is centrally located, and these two things are out on the periphery. They're extensions. This is really not that complicated. It really is just that simple. Peripheral nervous system right here, sensory input, and the motor output, that is it. The central nervous system is the integration part. So we have a functional separation, integration versus sensory input and motor output. And we have a structural difference or partitions here of the systems. All right. Figure 12.2 is pretty similar to this, and this is looking simply the same. So this was sensory input. It's now, the last figure has this going sideways. And now we're looking at it and it's up and down. But here's the central nervous system. And here's sensory input. And here's motor output. And what you're seeing is within the sensory input, within the central nervous system, and within the motor output, there are subdivisions. Okay? So central nervous system, we said the function was sort of step 2 in the process. It integrates. The organs involved in the central nervous system are simply the brain and spinal cord. That's it. What are the components anatomically of the central nervous system? And the answer is brain and spinal cord. What does it do? Well, you can see it receives information. It integrates it, processes it. So there's a lot of recognition, categorization. I think about that a lot when I meet students every year and somebody reminds me of somebody else, or you see or learn about characteristics of somebody and you start putting them into a category of, oh, they're one of those. Yeah. And then I remind myself that every individual is different and that I might not want to just pigeonhole somebody into some category. Okay. So I try to work against the idea of simply making things too simple and to judge people in a very open-minded way and always being open to new information. Okay. That involves forgiveness. Okay. So receiving information, integrating it, thinking about it, reflecting on it, issuing the outgoing instructions, so deciding what to do, and then sending it out. So sensory input, integration, and motor output. Now the peripheral nervous system. We're back to the same slide. The peripheral nervous system includes then sense organs and then sensory nerves bringing in the information to the central nervous system. Then when the central nervous system sends out commands, those signals are sent out along axons that we call motor axons. And then this gets more complicated. And goodness, without this kind of picture art, this can actually be hard to understand sometimes or confusing. So when I looked at this and long ago, I started teaching this class. This is the figure, pretty much, that changed my teaching so that I started issuing and preparing lecture outlines. Now, I went to college, university, for 11 straight years. So those of you that are in just your second, third, maybe even fourth year, okay, 11, not 4, all right? And at the end of those 11 years, I took a lot of classes, an awful lot. I took way more classes than you typically take now to get a PhD. On top of my PhD, I also had 2 years of education classes for me to get a teaching certificate, to be able to teach middle school and high school sciences. In any case, nobody ever gave me a lecture outline, guys. 11 years, imagine all the classes. Nobody ever gave me a lecture outline. And it was this figure, this organization. I thought, you know what? If somebody can just kind of create a lecture outline, you could really understand this. Within the motor, there is somatic and autonomic. I'll just tell you. These are signals that are going out that you think. Grab my pencil, type on the keyboard, pull out my smartphone, and tap on the screen. Those are voluntary, deliberate kinds of things. On the other hand, there are signals that come out from the central nervous system that are automatic. Make your heart beat, breathe. Your digestive tract is moving food, partially digested food through the digestive tract. Glands are contracting automatically just as well. And then it turns out that within this autonomic nervous system, which I regularly think of as automatic. So if you want, learn the name autonomic, that's the name, but then think automatic. Okay. Within these systems, there are two branches even of that. Sympathetic and parasympathetic. A lot of their actions, parasympathetic and sympathetic, tend to reverse each other. So we'll learn more of that. In fact, it'll be one of the last things that we learn about on this nervous system whole topic. Okay. So I'm reviewing here. Peripheral nervous system is steps 1. That was 2. 1, central nervous system is 2. 3, motor output. Okay. There are nerves coming off the central nervous system. We said the central nervous system has 2 parts, the brain and spinal cord. Nerves sometimes come off the brain, like for example, the nerves that go to the salivary glands come off your brain. Or some nerves, most nerves, are probably coming off the spinal cord. Okay. Well, we call spinal nerves the ones that come off the spinal cord, who would have guessed? And cranial for brain. So it means, the head, skull area. So cranial nerves come off the brain. But lots of terminology and comparison contrast, right? Compare and contrast spinal nerves and cranial nerves based on where they come from. Cranial nerves come off the brain, spinal nerves come off the spinal cord. Now for something truly new. In the peripheral nervous system, there are 2 anatomical parts, nerves, and the second part is called ganglia. Now, we haven't looked at a nerve cell and actually gone through the parts. But let me just tell you, a nerve cell has got a central nucleus, so there's a bubbly part, and then there are these really long extensions. And there might be a lot of these spinal nerves that are clustered in such a way that all of their nuclei are in one place, and then all their axons extend out. Boy, I'm trying to think about what that would be like. So it's like a ball-like thing where they're all clustered with little strings coming out. Nothing comes to mind right now. Well, those bundles of nerve cell bodies are the ganglia. Nerves are usually a bundle of those extensions, those axons coming off. So when we think about the difference between ganglia and nerves, it has to do with the parts of a nerve, an individual nerve cell. So we call those neurons. The parts of neurons, what are we talking about? A cluster of the cell bodies of the neurons or a cluster of the axons, really, of the neurons? We're going to look more at this as we go forward. So what do ganglia do? And there you go. And you've got this even as a handout, so I'm not going to stop and spend a lot of time for you to write notes since you can pause at any given time. So we're back to this. Peripheral nervous system. Information comes in, we think about it, we understand it, we remember things like it, and then we decide what to do about it. Okay? So there you go. Peripheral nervous system, central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. Within the sensory or afferent, and so this is where spelling always counts, A means towards. So these axons of these neurons are going towards the central nervous system. So you might want to remember it that way, that the perspective is towards or away from the central nervous system. And these kinds of neurons break down into 2 categories. Somatic, which comes from the muscle and the skin, and visceral, which is internal body organs. Okay. Right now, as I'm preparing this lecture, Lucy always loves to be with me. And she's making noise below, and I just have to tell you a funny story. So last year, during our horrible COVID stuff, I created lots of these lectures, and someone was listening, And in the background, they thought there was a problem with their computer or something because it was kind of a groaning going back and forth. And they emailed me, and I said to them, yeah, that was actually Lucy snoring in the background. So occasionally you might hear Lucy. Lucy, she's awake right now, so she's probably not going to be snoring. But on the other hand, she'll doze off in about 30 seconds. Okay, so back to the points, Velisco. Functional categories. So within the sensory right here, we have somatic and visceral, depending on where it's coming from, internal organs of muscle and skin. And then we have motor, and that's what we just looked at already as the subcategories. So these are axons that are leaving the central nervous system. And then I've already just talked about it, somatic, consciousness, and autonomic. So I already just explained this. Further divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic. I said these are often in contrast to each other, but I didn't mention that these are the systems, autonomic, so they're automatic, that are going to kick in the fight or flight response. And I'll be talking about that much later as we look at the nervous system. Okay? Because actually the autonomic nervous system here is about the last topic on this whole series of lectures. All right. The entire nervous system generally has two categories of cells. We have neurons and we have support cells. And the support cells are called neuroglia in the central nervous system. And they do all sorts of important things. So in the brain and in the spinal cord, there are neuroglia, which actually means nerve glue. And what they do are many different kinds of things. Physically support the neurons that are forming your brain. They insulate, and when we say insulate, it actually has to do with electrical insulation. So if you picked up any wire, any cord going into the wall, it's going to have some kind of plastic rubbery coating. And that rubbery coating is insulation, so you don't get electrocuted. They may be cleaning up the neurons. All right, now we got the snoring. It started. All right, now she's quiet. So there may be physical protection of the neurons. It might be some of the cells that clean out the cells that have died or attack any kind of infection of some sort. So it could be bacteria. Here's my point about neuroglia. The textbook does a great job. It tells you what they are, describes what they are, shows you nice pictures, and so there's really not a need for me to go over this in great detail. So don't write all this down. It's in your book. Okay. So the first one to talk about, there's no particular order, are astrocytes. Okay. What astrocytes do? Well, here you can see an artist drawing of what they do. They're helping to connect the neurons like this, brace them, and space them out like this. They're forming connections between the neurons and blood vessels. That's what you need to say. They're forming connections, and now Lucy's getting very loud. There you go. They're forming connections between the blood system and the neurons. And this contributes to something really important called the blood-brain barrier. And when pharmaceutical companies are manufacturing drugs that might influence or affect the brain, they have to get past this barrier. It has to be able to go from the bloodstream to the neurons here. And these cells, the astrocytes, are sort of fighting that or regulating that. And so I've been listening lately to all sorts of reports of progress that people have made, learning to do different things to help get chemicals past the blood-brain barrier so that we can fight maybe cancers or infections. Okay. Well, why do we have the blood-brain barrier? Here, there's things in your bloodstream that would be great if it didn't make its way to your brain, to your neurons. Okay. So that's some kind of regulation. What are microglia? Well, here's somebody's drawn it. And you can see these are phagocytes. So you got to remember your cell biology, phagocytosis, or cell eating, where a cell encompasses another particle or another cell and usually destroys it. Okay, so that's an important cleanup job in the brain. Now I talked about that insulation, and the insulation is provided by different kinds of cells. Here the insulation in the central nervous system. So these are axons, these are parts of a neuron. These are like the wires of our nervous system. Well, usually they have insulation, just like the wires. And I hope you know that if you have wires that are going to the wall or coming off some device that you're using, that insulation needs to be intact. You have to be really, really careful because if in fact it's broken or it's frayed somewhere, that's where it could spark and short and cause all sorts of problems in your house and with whatever devices are plugged in. Well, here you see an oligodendrocyte. And oligodendrocytes, even just one cell, so this is a glial cell, right? Here's the nerve cell body of an oligodendrocyte, and that nerve cell, the neuroglia, it's a glial cell, that cell has extensions that wrap adjacent axons. So one cell here can reach out almost like an alien and encompass parts of the axons of neurons, and that provides insulation. Okay. So these sheaths are said to be myelin sheaths. And the myelin sheath, you might not have learned this in cell biology. Oops, I just did the wrong thing, sorry. We might not have learned this in cell biology, but most of the time, by mass, so if you weight it, that a plasma membrane like this, so the outer membrane of a cell, usually has about an equal amount of protein and fats. But in myelin sheaths, the membrane is especially fatty. That's what you want to write down. There's extra fats, and I don't know if you know, but fats are really good electrical insulators. Fats are good electrical insulators. So these are cells with high fat membranes. Perhaps they're fat because they got a lot of candy at Halloween. I don't know. And now the last of the glial cells within the central nervous system are cells that line large cavities within our brain. So you might not have known that the brain has a chewy nougat center. Actually, it's not chewy, it's fluid, and the fluid is pretty much like the fluid that's between your blood cells forming your blood. And lining those cavities are ependymal cells. And here we see some of them drawn. But what I want to draw your attention to is the bottom down here. Because this is it, guys. This is the exception. When I talked about epithelia and covering and lining, I said at the bottom of every epithelium throughout the body is a basal lamina. That's a non-cellular sheet. And we said that in a simple epithelium, all the cells contact the basal lamina. Here's the exception. In the ependymal cells, in the tissue of ependyma, lining these large brain ventricles, cavities, there is no basal lamina. That's the exception. They're ciliated up at the surface. This looks like the sky, but this isn't the sky. That's why I added this label, I think, of a fluid-filled cavity. Anyway, these cilia are beating and waving, and they're helping to circulate the cerebrospinal fluid. So in case there's differences within the cerebrospinal fluid, we kind of even that out. Okay. Now there's two other kinds of supportive cells that we see in the peripheral nervous system. And in the peripheral nervous system, there are two kinds of insulating cells. Now, what provided the myelin sheaths for cells in the central nervous system? So you had 4 different glial cells that we just looked at. Which one provided insulation? Well, I can't see your hands, but if you just flip back, perhaps you can pause this lecture and go back. The answer is oligodendrocytes. Here in the peripheral nervous system, Schwann cells perform a similar function. Schwann cells are forming myelination. Now, it's a little bit at a time. This is almost like a train car with gaps in between the cars, so gaps in between the insulation parts. And I'll talk about the significance of that. But Schwann cells, and boy, this is huge, in the peripheral nervous system form the myelin sheaths. Oligodendrocytes form the myelin sheaths in the central nervous system. Okay. And finally, our 6th cell to look at that are supportive cells are these satellite cells out here. And they are insulating the nerve cell body of a neuron. So this is one neuron, got a great big nerve cell body, and we got axons coming out. Okay. And I had said to you, a collection of these nerve cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system is our definition of ganglia, of a ganglion. Lucy is really snoring. So now I'll look at a simple neuron. And here we've got a nerve cell body. And here we have an axon coming out that's branching. Here's a branch over here. And notice the arrows that indicate the flow of information. So signals here in the axon, this is really important, signals along an axon are moving away from the nerve cell body. Here we've got other little processes. This looks kind of plant-like, doesn't it? Like these are roots. Here we have other extensions that are called dendrites. And the dendrites are bringing information in like this. So it's almost like a bent tree, isn't it? It's kind of like a root system, and then this is the trunk of the tree going up here. Okay. So that's why we've got arrows here indicating that information is coming into the nerve cell body by dendrites and leaving the nerve cell body by axons. Okay, so there's the basic anatomy. Again, this is a neuron that could be in the central nervous system or a neuron that could be in the peripheral nervous system. And I told you that when you have a bunch of these neurons all clustered, they may be clustered with their heads in one region and all these axons extending over a long distance to another place. At the bottom of your back, at the bottom of your ribs, in your back, there are axons that form right there and go all the way to the tips of your toes. So how long is that? From your lower back, if you had your pants pulled up really high, it might be from the belt area all the way down beyond the legs of your pants, all the way out to your toes. So some of these axons, guys, could be many, many feet long, more than a meter long, and if you're talking about a large animal like a giraffe, these things can be many meters long. Okay? But the nerve cell body is usually located together in one place. So we've already talked about this. Dendrites, lots of them, bringing information in. Axons leaving the nerve cell body. It's usually just one axon leaving a nerve cell body. Okay, signals going out. Talked about that insulation. I want to talk a little bit more about it. How is it that a Schwann cell in the peripheral nervous system, how is it that it forms the myelin sheath? And the answer is it initially just basically wraps around the axon, and then it keeps wrapping, keeps going all the way around. So I don't know if you've ever done this, but you could take a towel and you could put a towel on your arm and then just keep wrapping it. As this happens, as it wraps, the bulk of the cell, the Schwann cell in this case, is at the outside edge. So as there's wrappings, this gets to be very, very thin. Lots of thin wrappings like this. So before, we'll talk more about the nodes of Ranvier. We can see another figure. But before, we saw that the wrappings here by Schwann cells were gaps. I said it was kind of like train cars in which there were little gaps between. The gaps in the myelin sheath are called nodes of Ranvier. I'm going to talk about what they do in just a few minutes. Oligodendrocytes, just to remind you, they do essentially the same thing as Schwann cells, but they do it in a little different way. So we said that we could have one oligodendrocyte myelinating several axons. So this is my analogy for a Schwann cell wrapping an axon. It's kind of like pigs in a blanket. So if earlier talking about brownies didn't get you excited about lunch or dinner or whatever time it is you're looking at this, maybe pigs in a blanket. So it's kind of like that, if you've ever done this. Sometimes our immune system attacks normal, healthy tissue in our body. We've talked about this before. I talked about an autoimmune disease that attacked acetylcholine receptors. Well, there are, and I think there's more than one autoimmune disease attacking there are different types of autoimmune diseases attacking the myelin sheaths, attacking the insulation of those axons. So what's that going to do? It's going to screw up signaling, right? It's going to short. And so when you want to send a signal to your muscles or your legs, it's not going to be a very strong signal. It might not even have a signal at all. And that's the case in multiple sclerosis. So here's the key part. In multiple sclerosis, your immune system is destroying and scarring the myelin sheaths. And so here's all sorts of the effects of multiple sclerosis. You're tired, you're probably depressed, you have trouble seeing, you have trouble speaking, and your muscles variously are weak and aren't responding. Same thing's going to happen in your digestive tract, so you have problems going to the bathroom in a couple different ways, right? Defecation and urination. Another such disease is called sometimes ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. I don't think anybody's suggesting that this is autoimmune. It seems to be caused instead by a neurotransmitter problem. And if you knew about Dr. Stephen Hawking, who was this brilliant physicist, had all kinds of great ideas. He was in college. He was doing really, really well. You might have seen the movie about him. And then he started developing this disease and losing control. But don't miss this. Lou Gehrig's disease is affecting motor neurons. It's affecting those that signal our body to move or react. But it doesn't affect the neurons used to think. So poor Stephen Hawking, and anybody really with this disease, is thinking a mile a minute just like you or I. But they can't make their mouth move. They can't expel air to speak. They can't do those things in the ways that they used to do it. And of course, it's a slow, gradual decline in which things get worse every year. It's horrible. And I've been teaching this class long enough that I'm I've now had to change the slides to tell you that this is what he used to do because he died. He's not alive anymore or with us. So this is bringing to a close this third recorded lecture on this first part of the nervous system. And what I'm urging you to do is to really stay up with chapter 12 and to read ahead, because what's up are details of action potentials. What we just looked at, just to recap here, basic anatomy of a neuron, different kinds of myelination we said were provided by two types of cells. So what were those cells? Do you remember? What were the cells that provided myelination? In the central nervous system, they were oligodendrocytes. In the central nervous system, I left off the S here. In the peripheral nervous system, it's Schwann cells. So go back before you get ready for the fourth recorded lecture, whatever comes next. Go back and take a look at the details of chemical signaling at a neuromuscular junction, because we're going to build on that as we get started on the next lecture. Okay? We're going to look at more neuroanatomy and the chemical nature of action potentials. All right? It's really, really well organized. It's a very straightforward presentation, but it's a lot of new material. Chances are, before you started this class, you didn't really know maybe the full structure and function of Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes. Distinguishing between the two, this is supposed to be CNS, central nervous system. Okay. So that's it. That's the end of this third recorded lecture, Fall 2021, Human Anat and Phys.